Hi there, I'm Christine Sips with Sips Media and Wired Schools. Today we have the guest of Alex Newman, and we're going to be talking about the hidden costs of public schools. And by that we mean the hidden costs are costs that our children who are in public schools will realize when they're in there. And also hidden are these crimes, for lack of a better word, or situations that our children will be exposed to, usually without parents' consent or even knowledge. So it's very important information that we're bringing this to you today. So I'm extra happy to have Alex Newman with us. And welcome, Alex. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be with you.
Great. And if I may, for those of you who may not be familiar with Alex's work, I'd like to offer a little introduction. And Alex is an award-winning journalist, educator, and prolific writer, author. He's written for many conservative publications to educate and inform and change things in the right direction. He's also foreign correspondent to the New America magazine. He's content manager for Red Pill University and a member of Freedom Force Leadership Council. He's placed his journalist boots on the ground in so many locations, contributing to his well-rounded perspective on the worldview. He's lived in 8 countries and is fluent in several languages. He's husband and a father of 5. So that especially qualifies you, as far as I can tell, for what we're talking about today. So with that, you're bringing your impressive experience and expertise. So Alex fights for family, freedom, and faith. So with that, I have pulled from your book, Crimes of the Educators, as well as your website, Public School Exit, to pull together some talking points. So feel free to ask me to move to the next one if you want me to, add some of your own, etc. So I'm going to let you do the heavy lifting, Alex, and I'd like to share the screens if you like along the way. And we'll be stopping around 45 minutes for question and answer. So how about we begin with a light one? Treason. The deliberate dumbing down of a nation.
Well, thank you. And, a lot of people hear that. Actually, I had a major newspaper, the Spokane, the Spokesman Review, the main newspaper up in Spokane, Washington. They did a front page article where they said that I had accused teachers of treason. And I had to call the editor and say, look, that is absolutely false. I did not accuse teachers of treason. You probably should have read the book before making a wild accusation like that. So they did have to run a correction the next day. But you know how it is. The lie goes out and then the correction appears in tiny little print in the back where nobody sees it. So that was a very dishonest interpretation of what we said. But there is a real element of treason here. If you go back and you look at the motivations of the people who created this abominable system that now plagues our country, the so-called public school system, what you'll find is that their motive was to overthrow our system of government. And they didn't want to do that by just presenting better ideas. They didn't want to do that through any established process that we have. If you want to make radical changes to the way our system works, we have options for that. We have a process for amending our Constitution. If you think something is seriously wrong with our system of government, then you make your case to the American people. You propose a constitutional amendment. You get that either passed through Congress and then ratified by the states, or approved by the states and then forced into the Constitution. So we have mechanisms for that. But the people who set out to build this system had an entirely different idea. They said, look, we're going to capture the children and we're going to use that for revolutionary change in America that will completely alter our political institutions, our free system of government. I'm referring primarily to John Dewey, although he certainly wasn't the first, but he was the most explicit. Now, to give you a sense of how radical this man was, he went over to the Soviet Union and was just in love with what they were doing there. In fact, he wrote a whole series of articles celebrating the Soviet system in American journals, talking about what a great system it was. And he was especially pleased with their public school system. He celebrated the fact that it was instilling a collectivistic mentality in the children. And that's what he wanted for America. In fact, he had a model that he wanted for America. It was a book published by Edward Bellamy in 1888 called Looking Backward. And it was a fantasy, a novel about a communist America in the year 2000, where we would dispense with private property and all this Christianity and all these other things that make up America. So you automatically have this subversive element there. Now, treason is a very serious charge, but it means essentially waging war against your own country, collaborating with the enemies of your own country in the destruction of your country. And I submit to you that that is what John Dewey was doing. I submit to you that he understood full well the implications of what he was doing. He understood full well that he could never get these ideas passed if he had just presented them to the American people. We republished one of his essays in the back of the book called The Primary Education Fetish, where he acknowledges that we have to do this quietly, right? He says change must come gradually. To force it unduly would compromise its final success by favoring a violent reaction. So fast forward, that's early 1900s. Fast forward to the modern era. And in 1983, Ronald Reagan put together a commission, the National Commission on Excellence in Education. And government committees aren't normally known for their incendiary rhetoric, right? Typically, their reports are rather boring and rather staid. But this report concluded that the educational system in America threatens our future as a nation and as a people. They concluded that if a foreign power had done this to us, we might have viewed it as an act of war. And I submit that we should view it as an act of war. It was an act of war, but because it was perpetrated by domestic extremists, people with a radical agenda who were born in the United States, who were U.S. citizens, that would make it not an act of war from a foreign country, but an act of treason from people here in the United States. So when you realize the whole monstrous plan to dumb down our children, to turn them against their parents, to turn them against God, to turn them against our free political institutions that created the most prosperous, the most successful nation in human history. And then you realize that they were doing it by subversion. It's one thing to advocate stupid ideas publicly. If a communist wants to come out and say, hey, I think we should all be slaves to a total government that will make all of our decisions for us and will torture people who resist that. Okay, you're free to make those stupid arguments. And the American people are free to reject those arguments. But when you say, hey, we're going to do this quietly, we're going to go for their children, we're going to manipulate their children to implement this system that people would never accept otherwise. As far as I'm concerned, that's an act of war against your own country. And we should call it what it is. That is treason. I recognize, again, that that's a serious charge, but I think what they did, what they perpetrated against us was a serious crime. And the only word that does justice to this is treason.
Very well said. And I'm glad to offer you another additional platform to clear the air, so to speak, on that topic. Very important, as you said. And like you said, with John Dewey being in the background, he had good company, as I understand. I had the pleasure of interviewing David Rodriguez a couple of years ago, and he shared with us about the history of the school education. And he mentioned that David, as you may know, is considered a guru of homeschooling, and he's also worked on a book and in concert with the late John Taylor Gatto, and who taught for over 30 years. And David shared the quote by Johann Fichte in 1806 as they were preparing their schools in Prussia, quote, "Education should aim at destroying free will so that after pupils are thus schooled, they will be incapable throughout the rest of their lives of thinking or acting otherwise than as their schoolmasters would have wished. When the technique has been perfected, every government has been in charge of education for more than one generation will be able to control its subjects securely without the need of armies or policemen." That was from his 8th address to the German nation. So that's interesting. And you mentioned about, being America and the Constitution. And as I understand it, that it is against the Constitution to do business with a foreign entity. Yet there's so much influence, so much of a driving force, as I understand, from the United Nations, that's driving Common Core and the sex ed, et cetera, et cetera. So it seems like there's not a lot of what goes on in this world that doesn't, the agenda and all of that coming in from them. I just wanted to ask you, when might teaching methods be qualified as potential child abuse?
Well, I think there are many things taking place in the government school system that ought to properly be classified as child abuse. And to be clear, again, I'm not accusing teachers of deliberately participating in child abuse. Certainly some have. The U.S. Department of Education actually came out with a study some years ago where they found that something like 10% of children in government schools would experience sexual harassment, molestation, or abuse at the hands of a government school employee. So certainly there is some of that actual physical child abuse being perpetrated by teachers. But the system is abusing these children in an incredible way as well. One of the most obvious ways is by dumbing them down. Again, this is not to say that the teachers are deliberately participating in this, but the people who created this system, the people who put these structures in place, they knew full well what they were doing. We'll start with the obvious one. Creating illiterates on purpose. So the first time that this whole word method was tried out, this way of teaching reading where they teach children to memorize whole words, first time that this was tried out was in the earliest government schools we really had in America, in Boston, under the leadership of Horace Mann, the Secretary of Education there. And it was right away, I mean, within a couple of years of this being tried out in the schools in Boston, it was obvious that it was a disaster of unprecedented scale. All the schoolmasters in Boston got together. They wrote a letter. I've actually got a copy of the letter. It was should be right behind me. It was published in a book by Samuel Blumenfeld called The New Illiterates in 1973. And this was basically the Boston schoolmaster saying, look, Horace Mann, we tried out this program that you wanted where we were going to teach children to read by teaching them to memorize whole words. It doesn't work. It was a total disaster. It's not supported by logic or evidence or reason. And so we're going to have to stop using it. We're going to go back to using what worked for thousands of years. And we're going to go back to teaching children phonics. So we knew back in the 1840s that this didn't work. John Dewey came back about 50 years later, 60 years later, and resurrected this quackery. And he knew it didn't work, not just because it had been debunked as quackery in the 1840s, but because he tried it out in an experimental school that he set up with Rockefeller backing at the University of Chicago. He had this experimental school, and one of the things they did was they tried to teach children to read using this quackery. Well, it became very obvious very quickly that these children were graduating either illiterate or at least handicapped when it came to reading. They knew this. Anybody could have known this. In fact, some of the people who were damaged have spoken publicly about this, including some of the Rockefeller boys. Right? They were wealthy enough that they could hire secretaries to do all their reading for them. And so, they could still get by in life because they are billionaires. Most of us are not billionaires. Most of us, if we're deprived access to being able to read, if we're deprived access to books and knowledge that is acquired through reading, that's going to make our lives very, very difficult. It's going to be a significant handicap. So John Dewey knew very well what he was doing. And yet, even after discovering that this was going to produce illiteracy, he set out to create textbooks that would eventually be used all across this country that incorporated this quackery as the way to teach reading. He did this at the University of Chicago and later at Columbia University at the Teachers College. So right away, we know that they deliberately set out to dumb down the children. If that's not child abuse, what is? Okay. I just published now on a whole nother front. I just published a couple of days ago a very in-depth investigation of the so-called sex education that is taking place in government schools. I encourage people to go read that. It was published in the Epic Times. It's available online. You need to see this. Okay. The disgusting perversion that they're teaching children, starting at age 5, is so abusive. It's so horrific that a lot of it you can't even be talked about because it's that abusive. They actually had to make exemptions in our state obscenity law because it's a crime to expose children to this kind of stuff. If a normal adult walked up to a child on the street and said, "Hey, look at this book," they would be arrested, okay, for exposing a child to obscenity, and quite properly so. Our lawmakers, our elected representatives decided that children deserve to have their innocence protected. They deserve to be protected from obscene images, obscene videos, perversions, and so on. And that was a good decision. And yet they went and they made exemptions in these laws. In many states, it's a felony to do this to children, but they made exemptions for government schools so that government schools could expose the children to this kind of thing. That is abusive beyond anything that we could have imagined even just a few years ago. The stuff that is being given to these children is outrageous. It's criminal. Then you add to that the drugging of the children, right? So first you scramble their brains with quackery, with pseudoscience, with idiotic ways of teaching reading. cooperating. And then they pretend like the child is the one with the problem. They say, oh, you can't learn using this quackery and you're bouncing off the walls and you don't feel like sitting still. Well, hey, we've got a solution to that. And they start pumping the kid full of amphetamines, right? If a drug dealer on the street were to sell amphetamines to your child, they'd go straight to prison, which is where they belong. And yet if the government school provides amphetamines to your child, they call it medicine and psychiatry and doing right by the child. It's grotesque. It's ridiculous. Children don't need amphetamines. They just need to be educated properly. So this is just a very brief snapshot of the abuse that's taking place in the schools. There is, of course, much more that we could talk about. I know we're limited on time, but I think that those three examples are clear-cut cases of abuse. If a parent did that to their children, they could be arrested. If any other adult did that to children, they could be arrested. And yet government schools are doing this in a systematic way. It's institutionalized. Not only are they not being arrested, they're getting massive amounts of taxpayer money to perpetrate these crimes.
You've covered a lot of my future questions beautifully. Thank you for that. And you're so right about like the ADHD and ADD and the psychotropic drugs that also contribute to violence. And also I wanted to mention today what is going on in schools. And we're going to include more information in the comments below. You'll have lots of links, including to the article Alex just referenced. I happened to catch that. But also I have a link to the War on Children about the comprehensive sexualization education program that is just abhorrent. And I was even going to mention that we likely will be drifting into mature audiences only territory today, is saying that, you can't really talk about it, yet they're exposing our children to this. So I think we maybe should at least allude to what some of these things are. Like, for example, I know when I was a child, used to go down to the library for story hour. Loved it. We pulled out our little sit-upons and they read us wonderful stories and let our minds wander. It was fabulous. But I don't know how I would react if they came out with a drag queen to read to us like they do today in libraries and schools. And, it's just amazing, the gender dysphoria causing children to question, do I really want to be a boy? Things like that. And maybe I'm venturing to where you're not comfortable talking about, but I know that, you know of what I speak, but it's just children are being exposed to this information before they're old enough to even know what it's about. And I would imagine that it would frighten them when they come across this material and not even know what to do with it. So it's criminal. It's totally criminal. Like one of the books, as you know, Alex, is Perfectly Normal. I was going to ask, when is perfectly normal? Not so much. So, but like you say, we can keep going deeply, or we can touch upon other things. So, but also another thing that's impacting children in schools is their exposure to wireless technology, from the devices, the Wi-Fi routers, the laptops. It's affecting their brains and bodies in future generations. I interviewed Associate Professor Ole Johansson, a world-leading authority on the health impacts. And I asked him, I said, are we effectively causing our own extinction? And he said, I believe that we may be. And he was kind of projecting how many generations we might have before our children might not be able to have their own. So it's very concerning, and also can lead to problems that would lead them to a diagnosis that would lead to the psychotropic drugs as well. But so, that's also there. And another thing that we're, Tom DeWeese from the American Policy Center, he has said that the classroom is no longer a place where a child learns basic academics, including history, math, or literature. Instead, the curriculum has morphed into behavior modification processes designed to destroy individual thoughts and values. Today's classroom has become a factory to turn out ignorant, compliant, global village idiots. And that's why the left has such a hold on them. That's social justice. So, that kind of goes with what we were talking a little bit there. Again, there's data mining going on. We're kind of jumping all over, but data mining is in schools that and they're compiling more data on students than even their parents have. They're creating detailed profiles on each child.